Welcome to the Why Factor, a chance to work out why we do what we do. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
Hello, my name's Jonathan Meyerson, and before you get to your chosen podcast, I want to ask you one question. How did an insignificant army corporal end up as Chancellor of all Germany? It's a story that's improbable and also a lesson for us all. My new podcast, Nazis, The Road to Power, unravels it in 16 dramatised episodes, starring Tom Mothersdale, Derek Jacobi, Toby Stevens, Alexander Vlahos and Laura Donnelly. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, welcome to the Why Factor. This week, we're starting in my back garden. It's a warm spring morning in my back garden. Forecast to hit 25 degrees C later this week. Scorching around here for the time of year. Sorry, didn't mean by that to start an argument or anything. I mean, what's controversial about the temperature? Except, of course, that in parts of the world, whether the world is hotter is an incendiary subject.
They introduced the so-called Green New Deal.
We're on offense on climate.
It sounds like a high school term paper that got a low mark.
I think they're just scaredy cats. They're just plain afraid.
There's a puzzle here. The temperature is what it is, surely. If it changes on average around the world, that's not in principle much different. All we do is measure it. This is science, not politics, right? But people fight over that measurement ferociously. Stranger still, the fight is on clear political lines. If we're on the left, we're more likely to say the temperature is up, changing the Earth's climate. If we can test that, we're most likely on the right. Why? I'm Michael Blastland, and that's our question in this week's Why Factor. When it all begins with not much more than a thermometer, why are people's beliefs in climate change so viciously politicised? Curiously, there was a time, says Naomi Oreskes, Harvard University's professor of the history of science, when climate change in the US was a problem, not a war.
Oh, yes, absolutely. We know from our research that scientists have been working seriously on the question of whether or not greenhouse gases would change the Earth's climate, at least since the 1950s. And back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was essentially a scientific question.
Maybe that was because we didn't understand it well enough for it to catch fire. Maybe the impact was still too far away. Even so, it's striking that in the late 1980s, says Naomi, an incoming Republican president could brandish green credentials.
I'm an environmentalist. Always have been from my earliest days growing up and then as a congressman.
So in 1988, when President George H.W. Bush runs for office, he runs saying that he will do something about climate change. He's well aware of the issue. It's been made an issue in the election campaign in the United States. And he even says he intends to use the White House effect to fight the greenhouse effect.
Some say these problems are too big, that it's impossible for an individual or even a nation as great as ours to solve the problem of global warming. My response is simple. It can be done, and we must do it.
But today in the US, party identification is a strong predictor of belief in climate change. In the UK too, as in much of Europe, Australia, Canada, numerous surveys find those on the left consistently report stronger belief in it than citizens on the right. How did that come about?
A split began to develop between the scientific community and the fossil fuel industry, in which the scientific community continued to work on deepening their understanding of this issue, but the fossil fuel industry began to take a different tack and to begin to cast doubt upon the science, to say that we didn't really know, and to do this in order to prevent political action on the issue.
the story she tells is of a group of right-leaning think tanks influenced by big energy companies who feared government regulation, who in turn influenced the White House. They chose, says Naomi Oreskes, to attack the science because they didn't like what it implied. They sowed doubt about the facts because they disliked their consequences. It was a tactic, she says, straight from the tobacco industry.
So a person might turn on the television and what they would see was two people arguing. And it would seem as if two scientists were arguing because they were arguing about the science. And so the viewer or the listener would get the impression that there was a scientific debate. And the tobacco industry even had a name for this. They called it Project Whitecoat. What these people did was to weaponize doubt. They used doubt as a weapon against science in order to prevent political action on climate change.
The key here is the link between what science says about the temperature and how people see, or are encouraged to see, the political consequences. From fear of the effects comes readiness to doubt the cause. The temperature is not a fact that stands alone. It became bound up, deliberately, she says, with other ideological and political values. And the energy industry did it. Naturally, though, there are other sides to this argument.
I worked on the House Science Committee. I was a staffer. I did a bunch of things. I wrote legislation and wrote speeches and dealt with lobbyists and just the standard broad array of things that Hill staffers do, which is one of the things that makes it so much fun.
Daniel Sarowitz, now Professor of Science and Society at Arizona State University, once worked on Capitol Hill, home of the United States Congress. Did it actually look like anything like the sort of stuff we see on the TV, the life on the Hill? What was it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think there is certain theatricality to a lot of what goes on in Congress. But our committee was pretty bipartisan. We had pretty good relations with the other side, even though we didn't agree with them on lots of things.
Bipartisan may be, but for Daniel, we simply don't, never did, never will, look at facts in isolation.
I don't think there was a time, at least since I got involved, where there weren't very different worldviews being brought to the issue. In preparation for this interview, I reviewed a couple of the hearing records of hearings that we held in 1991 on climate change. And, if you looked at the questions that came from the Democratic members, they were much more along the lines of how serious is the problem and how do we take action. And the Republicans' questions were much more along the lines of, but aren't the uncertainties great and aren't the actions going to be enormously expensive? So that kind of thing was certainly part of the agenda, at least going back to the early 90s.
If, in the 70s, climate change wasn't politicised, by the 90s it was certainly becoming so. And in Daniel's view, responsibility was shifting. It wasn't just big energy.
The problem is that as it emerged, the science and a particular political agenda became wedded to one another. And that was a political agenda of the left, of the Democrats. And it was a particular set of kind of policy tools and policy assumptions that were quite alienating to, dismissive of the sorts of political frameworks that Republicans might have been and conservatives might have been more friendly towards.
Such as?
Well, these are just principles that conservatives don't buy into in terms of the proper role of government. They're suspicious of international governance because of its competition with national sovereignty. They're very typically opposed to anything that requires higher taxes. And also conservatives are very suspicious of what you could call lifestyle agendas, social engineering, efforts of government to influence the way people behave. And so these are kind of things that struck at the heart of kind of conservative values and ideology, and it made it very difficult to have a good conversation about climate change.
In short, he argues, it was now the Democrats who framed the argument in a polarizing way. But then, he would say that, wouldn't he? And your perspective was Republican?
No, I'm a Democrat.
What? Let's hear that again.
No, I'm a Democrat.
I beg your pardon. How have I got that wrong? I do beg your pardon.
You've got that wrong because the things that I say and believe don't fit into a simple
You're absolutely right.
partisan slot, and that's part of the whole problem here.
Politics is easily caricatured, part of the problem, as he says. We could accept more of its subtleties. For example, that the right has traditions of conserving the planet, just like the left. Policy discussion on climate change could emphasise technological innovation, national energy security, the opportunities for enterprise, says Daniel Sarowitz, all of which might appeal to Republicans. It didn't, he argues. It emphasised things Republicans dislike most: government regulation, lifestyle restriction, United Nations interference. Republicans themselves could have pushed alternative solutions. They didn't. They chose to doubt the science and talk up the threat of regulation. Was all this inevitable?
No, I think it wasn't inevitable at all. I think the problem was using the science to drive a political agenda as if the science was the same as the value agenda behind it. I think that was the mistake that was made. I think many of us recognized that long ago.
The science did not demand one way of thinking, our way, whoever we are. Did both sides ultimately damage the science by saying it led to only one type of politics? Where are we now, 20, 30 years later? How would you characterise the spectrum now?
Yeah, we're in trouble.
On that, at least, Naomi Oreskes might agree, as the science now finds itself linked with values that are ever more confrontational. Take a recent book by Naomi Klein, which suggested that climate change meant we had to overthrow capitalism, called "This Changes Everything," a Republican's worst fears.
I saw the title, "This Changes Everything." My heart sank because I feel that it's raising the stakes in a way that's, I think, unhelpful. Because if to fix climate change we have to change everything, well, that's a much more difficult problem than if we just have to change some things.
You can almost feel the heat of that argument. How national politics evolved is a big part of the story of how climate became politicised. But it's not the whole story. And the next part takes us away from political history, away from the arguments on the Hill, and into the wider world, into the psychology of us all. Because the public lined up according to their politics too. How does that happen? It begins with how we feel about uncertainty.
The human soul can deal with many things, but it does not deal well with uncertainty.
Sander van der Linden is a psychologist who studies decision-making and uncertainty.
I think that really sums up also decades of scientific research in the behavioral sciences about how people think about uncertainties, that we don't like uncertainty. We don't like the feeling of not knowing what's going to happen.
But that brings an immediate problem.
The problem, however, is that uncertainty is an inherent part of existence.
Climate science, like much else, will never be certain. It's too complicated. Measuring the temperature over decades or centuries all around the globe and working out what it'll do next with what effects is inevitably imprecise. And that uncertainty creates room for argument.
If you're already skeptical about climate change, you can use uncertainty to amplify that goal. So, for example, let's say that there's some uncertainty about the future impacts of climate change. Now, you might say you use that in a motivated way. So what does that look like? You would say, well, the scientists are not really sure, right? There's some uncertainty about the exact science. So let's wait and see. We don't have to do anything about it yet because the science isn't settled yet.
Sander van der Linden found he could even measure the effect of conflicting information. Say people felt unsure about the truth of climate change, that it was 50-50, let's say. If it was simply stated to them that 97% of climate scientists agreed about climate change, this moved people's beliefs, whatever they were, by about 20 percentage points. If conflicting information, no matter how unreliable, was also thrown in, they didn't move at all.
What we found is that the presence of the misinformation completely cancelled out the power of the facts.
So what I take away from that, Sander, is that it's all grist to whatever we want to argue. So long as there are conflicting facts, apparently conflicting facts, people are going to take whatever they can find, and that's going to just push us further apart.
Exactly.
What do I do if I'm left feeling even a little uncomfortably uncertain about the facts? Psychologists tell us that one tactic is to take mental shortcuts. If we can't fully grasp the facts, and let's face it, who can grasp deeply how the climate works, then we shortcut that problem by consulting our feelings instead. In an experiment, Ellen Peters, Professor of Psychology at Ohio State University, tested the power of people's prior feelings and beliefs.
So what we did is we asked half of our participants to answer what was essentially a math question in a politically neutral skin cream problem. As you might expect, highly numerate people were more likely than the less numerate to answer the problem correctly.
But when they added politics, by asking a question about the effects of gun control, perfectly numerate people simply rejected numbers they didn't like, whether they were on the political left or right. So who would you guess is most likely to interpret facts to fit prior beliefs and feelings? Another experiment suggested a curious answer.
So we had a very large nationally representative sample of adults in the United States. And we simply asked them, what are your risk perceptions of climate change? But we also asked them some math questions. So we measured how numerate they were, how good with numbers they were.
The most numerate and the most literate were also the most likely to reject evidence they didn't like.
When it came to issues like climate change. And we interpreted our findings to mean that it was those people with greater ability who are simply better able to meet their goal at the moment. It didn't happen to be a goal about accuracy. It was a goal about protecting their political identity and beliefs. And because they had greater ability, they also had greater ability to meet that goal.
The simple idea here is that when someone tells us a number, like a temperature, what we think about it is influenced and sometimes pushed out by other beliefs, feelings, and goals. It's seldom about just getting the facts right, no matter how clever you are. Another big factor is who our friends are.
So when it comes to climate change, it turns out that accuracy is not the only goal that we have. On an everyday level, people have another goal, and that other goal has more to do with their fundamental social attachments and their needs to belong. If we want to remain part of our tribes, we might be better off not understanding the data better, because if I'm conservative, for example, and all of my friends are believing climate change doesn't exist or it's not particularly risky, if I go out and find out about those facts and I start to believe in those facts, it jeopardizes my relationships. And so what might be happening with these people is that they basically are seeing the costs of losing membership in their tribe now as really high. They really feel it in the moment. At the same time as the benefit that one person could do to climate change probably is not that big.
We're an awkward lot. In the space created by uncertainty, we feel free to pick and choose our evidence, to select only what fits with what we already believe, or simply to fit in with our friends. So what do we do? Is there a way of depolarizing climate change? Curiously, everyone we talked to found reasons for optimism. Naomi Oreskes, about to set off on a trek to Mount Everest base camp, looking over the planet, was worried, angry, but still hopeful.
Humans are very creative. We're very innovative. The climate is definitely changing, but we have not yet reached the worst case situation. So I do think there's still some grounds for optimism, but I definitely feel that the time, the hour is late. If we're going to fix this, we have to do it now.
Sander van der Linden has been researching ways of communicating uncertainty that don't send people running for emotional security instead. He says it is possible to admit uncertainty without frightening people away. He'd also try to decouple the science from solutions that threaten people's values and identity.
Can we present solutions in a way that doesn't provoke polarization on climate change? Yes, there are ways to depoliticize the discussion, but I would have to back up a little, and one way that we found, or we are able to do this in experiments, is to not mention policy solutions. Why is that the case? And we hypothesize that that is because it's what we call a non-identity threatening cognition.
For Daniel Sarowitz, simply saying clean energy instead of green energy can help push different buttons. You can't help wondering if it could all have been a lot less fractious, or if it has to turn into a war everywhere. Maybe not.
You know the tree hugger movement? In India, it's called the Chipko Andolan, which essentially means you hug something. And I thought it was fascinating that somebody was ready to give their lives for a tree. You know, it's just a tree.
Ayushi Awasthi says her environmentalism began in India as a child. She's now an environmental researcher.
I read through about how the vulnerable and the poor are always the ones that are so dependent on the environment. And they're also the first people to be hurt by anything you do to the environment. I just thought that that is something to definitely, not to sound cheesy, but like to dedicate your life to.
Not to claim India's record on the environment is flawless, she says, not at all. But a striking fact is that no one there really argues much about the facts of climate change. So if you're on the political left in India, are you more likely to accept the science behind climate change than if you are on the right?
I don't think there's any significant difference, not at least in terms of the science or the implications.
What does this teach us? That at the very least, polarisation is not inevitable. But why it didn't happen everywhere, or not yet, is hard to know. Could it be that India is more worried about tackling poverty? Or maybe a feeling that the more developed world is mostly to blame means India can relax? Ayushi, though, prefers another explanation.
The thing is, when you evoke the word earth in Hindi or in any of the colloquial Indian languages, it has a sort of spiritual or a religious angle to it. So you say Mother Earth, or so there's always the need to protect, or at least politically the need to go in the direction where you protect.
Will religious values keep India together on climate? When you look at the way the argument is conducted in the United States, do you thank your lucky stars that you don't have that sort of problem in India?
I do, because the chance of this becoming very divisive is even present in India. And I think once it goes in that direction, there's no coming back.
Why is climate so politicised? Because of what we attach to it. The paradox here is that what we attach it to is what makes us care. Identity, emotion, values. But what we care about most can provoke and polarise and paralyse any action at all. The Why Factor was presented by me, Michael Blastland, and produced by Phoebe Keane. The studio manager was John Scott and the editor was Richard Varden.
Hello, my name's Jonathan Meyerson, and before you get to your chosen podcast, I want to ask you one question. How did an insignificant army corporal end up as Chancellor of all Germany? It's a story that's improbable and also a lesson for us all. My new podcast, Nazis, The Road to Power, unravels it in 16 dramatised episodes, starring Tom Mothersdale, Derek Jacobi, Toby Stevens, Alexander Vlahos, and Laura Donnelly. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.